Let me jump into the program now and first introduce a wonderful panel. So Nancy Isenberg is the professor of the T. Harry Williams Chair of American History at LSU and author of White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America. And in trying to describe this book, which is a phenomenally well-written book, I chose the remarks from Michael Eric Dyson, who called this book, quote, a magisterial study of the unjustly neglected poor whites who have helped to compose the American identity in a crucial fashion. Dyson says Ms. Isenberg's White Trash reveals how class is made and reshaped over the decades. He calls her book breathtaking social history and dazzling cultural analysis at its best. That's a pretty good recommendation. Nancy Isenberg. And our other guest is Professor Phil Thompson. He's a professor of urban planning and politics at MIT. Before that, he was deputy general manager for New York City's Housing Authority, the director of the Mayor's Office of Housing Coordination, and he just returned to New York from MIT, he's on leave, to be deputy mayor for strategic policy initiatives in New York City. His most recent book, Double Trouble, Black Mayors, Black Communities, and a Call for Deep Democracy. Professor Thompson has written extensively about politics in a racially segregated nation. So please join me in welcoming these two distinguished thinkers. So I'm going to just jump into it and try to understand one of the themes that's occurred throughout this conference. We heard it from Reverend Jackson. We heard it from Jesse Van Tol. You heard it from me, and then Vanita Gupta at breakfast this morning, is this notion that we really need to build a broader coalition, go across racial lines, the need to see whether there's a way of building an economic justice movement that's much more inclusive, much bigger, and much more powerful, that includes obviously the folks we work with now, in particular people of color, but also includes many of the working poor and poor whites who have many of the same challenges that face us. And I want to ask Professor Thompson, Professor Isenberg, to what extent is this something that's important to do? Is this really necessary for us in terms of moving the needle forward on promoting a more civil, a fairer, a more just society? How important is this?
Well, one of the things that I tried to look at in my book is the way in which American politics, as I think we all know, has always very much been divided by race and class. And in fact, I come out of a tradition that assumes that race, class, and gender are, the most important variables that you need to look at to understand not just divisions, but the way in which identity politics have been constructed over the course of our history. One of the problems that I also try to address in my book is the way in which we often want to erase our past. Not only erase the past as far as racial injustice, but we also want to erase our past when we claim that America is the land of opportunity. And I take my study all the way back to colonial Jamestown, to the role of indentured servants, to the rise of slavery. And one of the things that we inherited that we tend not to acknowledge is that class identity has often been attached to land and property ownership, that those were important measures to be a citizen. And we also inherited from the British the idea that we think of valuable citizens as being defined by their breeding and their pedigree. And those terms, not only do they have racial connotations, they have class connotations. And this is what got me drawn into trying to understand the role of poor whites, the way in which they have figured prominently, not only in the politics of antebellum America, but colonial politics, the rise of the eugenics movement, the rise of the debates that centered around LBJ's Great Society, we're often talking about poor urban blacks in cities as compared to poor whites who lived in rural Appalachia. So I think one of the things we have, part of the way to develop coalitions, part of the way to develop empathy is that we have to understand our diverse history, and we have to understand and not want to reduce our history to simple sound bites. And that's really hard to do in this political climate when news journalists often are looking for catchphrases, are often looking for labels to attach to different groups of people and assume that that group is inherently coherent, they all have the same agenda, they all look at the world the same way, which loses the fact that groups, African Americans are divided by class, and white Americans as well as Asian Americans are also divided by class. And we need to sort of have a more complex way that includes our understanding of their past in order to tackle the problems that face us today.
Phil, you have anything on that? No.
I think that we have a very troubled and sick culture. And Martin Luther King said that the American dream had been unfulfilled. It was like a check was written, but there was nothing behind the check. And we are the first society in human history that allowed people to starve in the midst of plenty. There's been starvation before, but when there was starvation before, everybody was hungry. We are the first society in history that has all kinds of materials to build houses, and yet we let people go homeless. Food all in the stores, but yet people are hungry. And I think it reveals a sickness that's pretty deep. And we put God on our dollar bill. And when I read the Bible, it said, don't use the Lord's name in vain. But then we use the dollar bill to say, no, you can't have housing, no, you can't have food, because you don't have a dollar bill. If that's not using God's name in vain, I don't know what is. Mm-hmm. And we've gotten so accustomed to living with lies, to living with cynicism, that I think that's a deep sickness, and race is a part of that. Yeah. And to be honest, the most abused people in America right now are undocumented women, immigrant, domestic workers who have no rights, who have no voice, who can't even, they're in the shadows, they have to be in the shadows, and we don't talk about that. And I would say, as African Americans, if anybody knows what it's like to not have a voice, to not have rights, to be forced in the shadows, we do, and we have an obligation to embrace those women. Mm-hmm. And not just talk about black, white, but how do we talk about lifting up the people who are on the bottom, no matter who they are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm trying to get at this notion of, there seems to be sort of identity politics. You have civil rights leaders who work on behalf of African Americans, who work on behalf of Latinos, and work on behalf of Asians. I think there's somewhat of a dearth of civil rights leaders on the white side of the equation. But putting that aside, and hopefully we'll change that, by the way, but putting that all aside, there does seem to be this bifurcation between race and population on the very issues that matter to all of these races, and issues like systemic poverty, lack of education, lack of decent health care, on and on and on, all the issues that sort of relate to anybody who's in poverty. And it seems like the evolution of the civil rights and human rights movement in this 21st century has to be a way of breaking out of those boundaries and beginning to create collaboration and understanding across those races. And we talk a lot about the unions sometimes, and of course I started this session with talking about the unions, but a lot of times, particularly the trade unions that are in the building trades, for the longest time racially segregated. We saw in the last election that a majority of union members actually voted for Donald Trump. I mean, what's going on here? Not that the union members are necessarily poor, because union trades, you're actually getting a middle income. But why is it that we can't seem to build that coalition that that really relates to people who really have a lot more in common in terms of their struggle and their needs. What are the impediments to that?
Yeah, I think one of the problems, we talked about this before when we were, before this session, is that American politics has always relied on identity politics. One of the things that I go back to is the way in which Andrew Jackson, and I'll have you all know that Andrew Jackson's portrait is the one that Trump has in the Oval Office, claimed to represent the common man. Well, Andrew Jackson was a slave owner. He was not poor. He in no way could, in a sense, embody, and nor was he at all interested in extending the vote to poor whites at the time he was elected. And the part of the problem is, and this is something that an Australian observer that I quote in my book made this argument in 1949. He said that America has a democracy of manners as opposed to a real democracy. Because what he was saying is that democracy, we accept huge disparities of wealth, and we would add that we accept huge disparities in terms of how we racially divide our society. And instead, what we buy into is that we want our politicians to pretend to be one of us. This is why they all have to go to Iowa and eat corn dogs and wear plaid shirts. It's part of this long tradition of politicians pretending to represent the interests of people, particularly in the campaign season. And this even goes back to the 1840s. There's an old story of the Arkansas Traveler, where the planter elite in the South went to the backcountry. He appealed to the poor squatter, wanted to have a drink of his whiskey. The squatter ignored him until the planter jumped off his horse, grabbed the squatter's fiddle, and played his tune. What that's about is about democracy. The elites are still in charge, but the candidates speak or sound like the common people. They make claims and promises that they never fulfill. And the same way the wealthy planter, when he goes back to his mansion, does nothing for the poor squatter. Still, the squatter believes that somehow he's connected to the nation, because somehow that politician, for those few moments, and now we know the election season is for a whole year, pretended to be one of the people and pretended to be someone who was going to express their views. And we've accepted what I think is a really dangerous bargain, and a bargain that doesn't address any of the real issues that always get pushed to the side and are camouflaged by this pretense, this idea of the performative politician and the pretense of an identity politics.
So I guess in some ways it begs the question for me, because I get it that someone can go in a flannel shirt and overalls and go, oh shucks, and convince enough people to vote for them. But once they go up there and then they don't do anything that helps them, that they don't pass any legislation or support any legislation that helps working class and people in rural areas and the people that politician is appealing to, why are they getting reelected? Why is it that, where is the conversation that gets to the people and says, look, if you really want somebody who's going to represent you and your interests and move the needle for you and your life, you're going to need to vote for the kind of person who says this. They may not look exactly like the guy in the overalls, but he or she is going to be somebody that's going to really deliver for you in terms of your needs, your family needs, your household needs. I mean, what?
Well, I wanted to go back to your earlier question about labor. And first, the issue of poor people being in the same boat, white, black, brown, yellow, that's been true for a couple hundred years. We fought a civil war in this country, and a lot of people who fought in that civil war understood that poor people were in the same boat. I think the question is, how could we fight a civil war? 700,000 people died at a time when this country only had about 20 million people, right? 30 million people.
Right.
How is it that we're where we are now after what we've been through? right? How did that happen?
Not learn.
And I think the labor movement is connected to that question because the labor movement historically kept people of color out. It kept women out. The labor movement wasn't really about labor. Because if you were about labor, you would trace your history to slavery and make Harriet Tubman would have a big portrait in the AFL-CIO hallway, you know, down the street here. There's no Harriet Tubman. She was the greatest labor leader in my mind in the 19th century. Because if 250 years of unpaid work isn't about labor, I don't know what labor is. But the labor movement said it began when white men formed a union. No, it didn't. That wasn't the beginning of the labor movement. Let's go to 1630s and talk about Bacon's Rebellion as the beginning of the labor movement. But they didn't do that. So finally, when black folks started getting into labor unions through lawsuits in the 1960s and 70s, and the labor movement began to embrace more people, suddenly the labor movement became intolerable. And corporations went all out against it, and now it's down to 7% of working people belong to labor unions. And I believe there's a reason behind that. And that is whenever there's been a broad movement that brings people together across race, across gender, it has come under severe and sustained attack every single time. And I don't think labor has even figured it out to this day, which is why 40-some% of AFL-CIO members voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah. So it's what I really want to get to is whenever people seem to be getting together, whenever there's conversations and organizing and working to bring poor people together, there does seem to be movements, legislation, efforts, things that break that up. And I'm wondering why. I mean, we understand this, we've known this for a long time. What is it going to take for us to get, we showed a slide yesterday in which the poor and the near poor in the white community constitutes 44 million people. Why is it we can't get 10 million of those people to get it, that, you know, the struggle you're having for affordable housing, for health care, for public education, for all the things, for feeding your family, for having a livable wage, all those things are a struggle that's over here, and these voices, black, brown, Asian, and some whites, are talking about changing that scenario. I mean, people always will say, oh, that's because the rich in this country want to keep us separate. And as you mentioned in the green room, you know, there's basically a couple of thousand billionaires, but there's you know, nearly 100 million poor people in this country who come from all races. Why is it, I mean, if they had the power, if we built that power, if we brought them together, we really would have a different democracy here. And we, instead, we continue to talk about the history, and I realize I have two historians up here, so we're going to get history, and I was a history major, so sorry, but we love that. But what is it from history we can say, here's how we're going to really change things. Here's how we're going to bring people together. Here's what will make the difference. The unions started to smarten up lately because they realized that as the population changed, their numbers were going to dwindle as union workers. They still haven't dealt with the politics of the unions and how they, you know, engage people to understand why they should be voting for progressive candidates who support labor laws and expanding union opportunities. But what is it that we've learned from this history, either one of you, that tells us this is really where we need to focus? This is how we bring people together. This is how we get people on the same page. Because the numbers, the people who need this, who support this, who would benefit from this, are far more than the 2,000 billionaires who run this country.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was trying to do in my book is recover our rural past. And this is part of the problems when we talk about labor. One of the issues that I focus on, which you probably never realized, but in the colony of Georgia, there was an effort to not allow slavery to be established. And that was put in place by a man named James Oglethorpe, and he basically argued that if you were going to set up a colony that is going to allow poor debtors, which were one of the main groups that were being transported to Georgia, to be independent, to own their own land, you cannot allow for the creation of a large slave planter elite. And this is one of the things that we tend to ignore, that the large slave planter elite, not only did they own and exploit slave labor, but they monopolized the land. And they also created a very large poor white population. So one of the issues that we have to recover, we talk about labor, we have a certain model. And this is something that Trump exploited. Trump, the builder, his idea of the modern laborer is the man in the hard hat. That's our image of who is the image of the working class. But that, in a sense, leaves out large numbers of groups that have been workers and laborers throughout our history. One of the points that I made before when we were having our conversation that most Americans don't realize is that early indentured servants, and this also influenced the establishment of slavery, were children. And we had child labor in this country. It was legal until 1919. So we have areas which we just ignore. Alexander Hamilton, which I know is very popular because of the musical Hamilton, when he wrote his report for introducing establishing economic policy in the United States, stated the British idea that the groups that should be working in industry, the groups that should be working in factories were women and children, even children of a tender age. So we ignore, the same way we ignored women because it was assumed they weren't really working because work was in the home. We ignored children, the way in which they've been exploited, and they were a whole part of the theory of men being independent free laborers. This goes back to Benjamin Franklin. The idea that if you were an independent free laborer and you weren't going to rely on slave labor, then you were going to have to rely on the labor of your wife and your children. They were going to be your servants. They were going to be the laborers that you use. So we have to broaden how we think of labor. We have to broaden how we think of class. Class isn't just about your income. And we have to recover, I think, these areas that we ignore in order to try to be inclusive and not just celebrate one model, one ideal, whether we think of who's the ideal citizen or who's the ideal laborer that we're talking to.
I'm a social scientist by training, and I think we need to stop listening to social scientists. And we need to not frame the predicament we're in terms of issues as they're defined by social scientists. There's a housing issue, there's an employment issue, there's a healthcare issue, there's a bank reinvestment issue, there issue after issue after issue. I think we have to start talking more in terms of people, and sometimes theologians are better at that than social scientists are, but Donald Trump is talking about sending soldiers to the border to shoot at children. God doesn't send babies to earth with citizenship papers. So we need to talk about it at that level. We're talking about children. We're talking about babies. I don't care where you come from. It goes deeper than the issue of immigration. It goes to who we are. In America right now, there is really no majority. Soon there will be a minority nation, but that means there's no majority. And I think even right now, when we talk about movement building, I don't care what group you're in. I don't care if you're a poor white. I don't care if you're an environmentalist. I don't care if your issue is immigration, or if your issue is housing, if she's gay and lesbian rights, or issue is civil rights. You're not going to win by yourself. The only way you're going to win is with these other people together. So really your issue doesn't matter. That's not what's crucial. We all have different issues. That's not what's crucial. What's crucial is we support one another. What's crucial is we're together. If we're together, we win every issue. Every issue.
So,
if we're together. If we're not together, we don't win a single issue. So we ought to be talking about how do we get together, not my issue versus your issue. We need to get away from that.
So that's what I want to talk about. And by the way, I hope you didn't miss that the first state that in the South that tried to eliminate slavery was Georgia,
Yeah.
this Oglethorpe, who, by the way, got crushed later on by the other southern states. But
Yeah.
Georgia's in the room. You could, a little bit of history for you on that, that you were the first to try to outlaw slavery and create a different state in the South. But unfortunately, that didn't work out. But I think Professor Thompson has brought us to where I hoped it would be, which is if we can get beyond our own issues, get beyond the own identity group that we identify with, and begin to build not walls but bridges and opportunities for collaboration and understanding, that will eventually bring people together. And when we do come together in that type of a coalition, the world is our oyster. You know, the democracy is the democracy we'll get to define. But it's not the first time I've heard this, with all due respect. And this decade is not the first time I've heard that. And the question is, are we evolving as a civil rights, human rights industry, allow me to call us an industry, to the point where we get it, and now our purposeful, our intent, our observations, our work has to be moving people in our movement, you know, who might say, wait a minute, we're a gay rights organization. Why are you talking about, you know, white poverty? Or we're black civil rights organizations. We're about justice. Why are you talking about? We all know, especially people in this room, we've got to get beyond that. But it seems to have been a challenge, and I guess I'm asking you as a social scientist, and not a historian now, you'll be the social scientist, and the historian, you know, what is it that we can learn in addition to understanding the social scientists themselves like to bifurcate the issues and people and then focus on each one. How is it that we can move and advance this movement to a point where as we do our work, whether it's in housing or community development or economic justice or social rights and so on, how is it that we can have the conversation in a way that brings people from other communities, in particular from that 44 million poor whites, who can begin to identify that the agenda of progressives, the agenda for trying to create a more perfect union and have people come together and work together, how is it that it's possible for us to make advancements in that space? I keep asking this question in different ways, and I'm not going to let you off the hook until I get some ideas from you.
Well, I've been teaching the film To Kill a Mockingbird for 15 years. I teach a film and legal history course. And I still think that, you know, Atticus Finch's idea that he presents, the fictional character, you can't understand someone else unless you walk in their shoes. And I think this is part of the problem, and this is part of the reason I wrote this book, is that the way to empathy is understanding. And I really do believe, this is why I'm a historian. I mean, people always want to marginalize history and say, who cares what happened 50 years ago? It doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, because the things that are part of our past come back to bite us and don't disappear. We may think that we have become more enlightened and that progress is inevitable, but it's not. Many of the worst ideas can be repackaged and represented, and that has clearly been a part of American history. So part of the understanding process, I think, is we all carry around assumptions. We're born with assumptions. We have assumptions whether we come from our family, from our regional area, from our tribal groups, from our experiences, that we think we have a way of looking at the world. And what can disrupt that? What can get us to sort of look at old problems in new ways? And this is where I think history is important. And I think that when I've had people respond to my book, you know, they've said, you know, you've presented things to me that I never heard in my high school history class. I never heard in my college class. You explained to me things that I never quite could figure out. So this is where I think education, and education in a way, not in our media climate when it's about like yelling at people and we have a hierarchy of victims, which group is more oppressed, and we have an environment which is really about, you know, a revival of this survival of the fittest, this kind of really brutish way of zero-sum game. I think that if people could take the time to look at the past. In the past, I think history can function in the same way that writers talk about science fiction. I will admit, I love Star Trek Next Generation, because in science fiction you can talk about really controversial issues, and people will think about it and they won't feel personally attacked. History can serve a similar purpose. It forces us to step out of our own ways of thinking and understand a different set of people under different circumstances, but then learn from it in a way that allows us to reevaluate where we are. So this is why I feel history, and we have to find a way to speak a new language, and I'm hoping that history may be one way, as it has on other civil rights issues, as a way to kind of reimagine and rethink the problems of how race and class and gender have defined us.
I think that, I agree with that. And I think that black people historically, Latino people historically, have had to pay careful attention to what white people think and what poor white people think. It's dangerous not to. There was a black political scientist named Michael Dawson who did a book called Black Visions, which was a study of black public opinion. And what he found was that 90-some% of black people think America is a deeply racist society, but 85% of black people think America is a deeply class society. Black Americans understand they're poor white people. That's not news. Black folks know that, always have. Amongst white Americans, the numbers were almost reversed. About a quarter thought America was a class society. It's probably a little higher now. And then like 20% or less thought it was a racist society. So I think part of the challenge, for the first time in history, poor white people, working white people are really going to have to pay attention to what black and Latino people think. That's new. White folks got to learn that.
Yeah.
They got to learn how to complicate their thinking, complicate their identities. And black folks can't be so consumed in anger and resentment that we don't engage with white folks and that we just say, it's useless, it's hopeless, we're not going to extend ourselves. We both have challenges that we're going to have to overcome in this period, and if we don't, we're going down together.
Yeah.
We're going down together.
So I'm glad the way you said that too, is that it's both sides, to find a way for people, white people, to be able to listen and understand and hear from black leaders and Latino leaders. But that conversation to those whites has to be said in a way that's not pushing them away at the same time, but is engaging them and building an awareness and understanding that isn't angry, but is really almost educational, for lack of a better word at the moment. And it gets back for me to what Professor Isenberg said a minute ago, and she started the conversation. It's about building empathy and compassion. And can we ever build empathy and compassion between the races in this country if we continue to have segregated communities? Is it even possible? Regardless of whether we change our wording, our branding, and messaging, if people are all living over there, it gets to the percentages of how many whites think there's a class society or a racist society. Is their imagery, their understanding, and living in rural America or in segregated communities, blacks living mostly in urban, and with some exceptions, we're about as segregated as we've ever been. And how is it possible that we're really going to be able to listen to each other and eventually be empathetic to each other, so that we will break down these walls of disidentification with each other and be able to build a real movement of working class and poor people to create a better society? How is it possible?
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues, because my book is talking about not only rural America, but the way in which class definitions came from associations with the land. That in early America, there was the assumption that people were analogized to animals. They were, if you had a healthy, productive land, you would have a healthy, productive people. So class is often, we tend to underestimate as I said, the same way class isn't about income or what job you have, it's historically has also been identified with not only whether you're a property owner, which is still an issue, whether you're owning a home, that's seen as a measure of moving into the middle class, but it's also, it's very much about a class and racial geography. And this is something that I think is really true about why we are divided. Not only do we have today people living in gated communities, I mean, what could be a more powerful metaphor of saying, I don't want anything to do with anyone outside of my fortress. And in fact, one of the cases that I deal with in California, and this was in the 70s, because I also talk about how when we had the growth of the middle class and the rise of suburbia, we also had the growth of zoning laws, which divided people by class. And then in California, in Richard Nixon's own hometown, they wanted to build a trailer park, and to get it built, they had to build a wall around it. Because the people who lived outside the wall didn't want to see those people, didn't want to actually know that they lived in their neighborhood. And I think this is a problem. I think that when you are divided geographically and you're not sharing the same institutions, then this is just another way to build walls, another way that if you actually live in a town and you share the same sidewalk, you're going to kind of interact with those people differently than if you, again, can divide people and sort of assume that where we live, what we do on a day-to-day basis very much shapes both our racial and our class perceptions.
I would say desegregation is not the same thing as integration. Harlem is being desegregated. Central Brooklyn is being desegregated. And resentment is very high right now because wealthier white people are pushing out poor black people or causing their rents to go up. And there's no love happening here.
Right.
And integration is different than just having white and black people near each other. Slave plantations, white and black people were near each other. It's about an intention to want to love another person who's different from you, and the intention has to be there. So the question to me is, how do we create that intention? And you can look at it different ways. I think the human predicament is, we are all visitors on this earth for a very short time. But we have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. None of us know where we came from. None of us know where we're going. We're only here for a short time. Our human predicament is we're acting like idiots and fools at all levels, right? So where do we begin to address that? That's the broader context. Now, the best day I've had since being deputy mayor was yesterday. And I went with the mayor and the new school's chancellor, Richard Carranza, to an elementary school in the South Bronx where we're initiating 3K, universal preschool for 3-year-olds. We have it for 4-year-olds now. We're doing it for 3-year-olds. This was a bilingual 3K school program, and the 3-year-olds were learning how to play together in the sandlot and how to share the shovels. And then the 3-year-olds made a tea party for the mayor, the school superintendent, for me, and they made us all sit down together, and they served us bananas and tea, and the children were learning how to play together. Even though they speak different languages, they learn each other's languages. And I was like, I wish the whole Congress could go through this program. Because these kids are not gonna hate one another, even though they're different. So it's a big question you ask, but I really think it's deeper than having one person living in a house across the street from somebody else living in a house.
Right. So obviously you're talking about the gentrifications of communities of color. What if we desegregated not only along race but along class lines, that we had strategic and organized efforts as we began to desegregate communities, that we made sure that there was room at the inn for all classes of people, all races of people. In other words, some of the places we'd love to desegregate that are, say, all white, might be middle-income communities, and having people of color move into those communities, that's fine. They would probably be of the same class. But in inner cities, neighborhoods, and so on, isn't it incumbent upon the mayors and the political leaders locally to ensure that you manage that process in a way that you don't gentrify to a point where the indigenous people in the community have no place to go? Can't you manage that? Can't we come up with strategies that manage that along class lines as well as race lines? It's not easy.
Not if the will isn't there.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, a politician isn't going, the truth of the matter is, a lot of people with money don't want to live near people who don't have money. That's the truth.
That is the truth.
And so the intention, the will has to be there. It's not going to start with politicians because they're trying to get elected and reelected.
Right.
It has to start at a people's level, and we have to get beyond the superficial conversations.
Yeah.
The superficial conversation is, can't there be a policy tweak?
Right.
No, the real issue is we've been racially divided for 300 years. Have we had enough of that?
Yes.
Have we had enough of that? Do we want to have a different kind of world to live in with one another? Do we really want that?
So to get beyond the rhetoric, you know, in the Civil Rights, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, there was a little-known provision until very recently called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing section in the Fair Housing Act, and it was basically said, you know, it said to these communities that you have to, middle income and other communities, you have to have plans to allow people of different income and different racial composition to be able to move into your community. You have to come up with plans that do that. And, you know, in the Obama administration, they finally wrote the rule. The law was passed in '68, and it wasn't until very recently we finally came up with the rule. And no sooner did this black Secretary of Housing get into office before he turned around and pushed that rule down the road. You know, so maybe this, and he pushed it to 2020. So he couldn't eliminate it, but it's still there, and who knows what happens in the future elections. But that's an opportunity for us to begin to manage these situations in a way that you're not going to get federal money if you aren't creating in your community room at the end for people who are different, or different classes and different races.
Yeah. No, I mean, I want to use a historical example. I think sometimes, you know, when we talk about the whole history of desegregation, you know, one of the most well-publicized, most historically well-known moment is what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. But often what's left out of that story is that in Little Rock, there were 3 high schools. And the school that was chosen for desegregation was the working class high school. The elite school, which was called Cadillac High, was not. Desegregation was not applied. And this is part of the problem. When we only get a part of the story, or we don't realize that when we're trying to solve a problem, we don't actually impose the new rule across the board. We hide class privilege that's often at work at the same time we're trying to institute more fairer policies. And you know, I think it's extremely difficult in American society because often we don't want to talk about class, we don't want to acknowledge class privilege, we don't acknowledge nepotism. You know, I can go down the list. We don't acknowledge, and one of the things, the reason that gender is so important to my study is, and this relates to your story about 3 years old, is that class begins also the day you're born. And that class privilege is something that's reproduced. It's reproduced in families. And even today, I know you don't like social scientists, but a group of sociologists have found that in 2016, still one of the most important determinants of whether you're going to be successful in America is the wealth and privilege you inherit not only from your parents, but your ancestors. So we are still trapped in this idea of inheritance. And we often assume that, well, of course parents are going to do things for their children, to help their children, do everything possible to advance their children. But then what we leave out of that discussion is that's also about endowing your children and exercising your class privilege, and that we don't start at the same place.
I don't think anybody black doesn't know about that. You know, about inherited privilege. I think we know about that. You know, I'm not saying that to be arrogant, but I'm just saying I think the challenge I want to pose, and I do think it's important that people who don't know about that learn about that.
Well, I would just say a large number of people, students that I teach, prefer the myth of opportunity, the myth of American exceptionalism, the myth of meritocracy, and don't want to engage with the privilege that they have.
I'm not arguing against that. I'm all for it. But what I'm saying is, I don't think the Fair Housing Act is going to succeed with the
AFFH.
politics we have right now.
Absolutely.
And I don't think the rhetoric about Bernie Sanders' rhetoric did not succeed. Okay? Bernie lost 75% of the black vote in the primary, which is how Hillary Clinton beat him. And it was because Bernie Sanders danced around the central issue of racial division in America. Right. He had to be forced to get there. And we got to start having the real conversation, which is about the racial divisions between us. If we fix that, then there will not be another Donald Trump. If we don't address that, Donald Trump may not be the worst that comes. We're about to have, things are about to get worse in this country.
Try not to depress us with accuracy. That particularly hurts. You know, it's you talk about having that conversation. You know what always strikes me as a white man who cares about race and cares about bringing racial diversity together is whenever, like in Boston, whenever they have a race conversation, you look up on the stage, there's black, there's brown, there's Asian, very occasionally you'll have a white person, as if they're not part of that race conversation. And if we're trying to build an awareness and understanding where people really do understand, I think there are a lot of people who really don't understand, particularly in poor whites and who are looking there, they're like, man, I don't know what's going on with black people, but I just know I got nothing. I didn't inherit anything. The geography I'm born in probably means I'm going to be poor and my kids will be poor. And yet, to get them to understand, and for us to understand them, the struggles they're going through, to build this movement in the future that ensures that we do not have the kind of electorate that sends people like Donald Trump. I can't see how we're going to really alter that if we don't find a way to have this conversation which enrolls people, engages people in a way that not only is building their understanding, but is building their empathy and compassion for each other. I don't see how that, Phil, if we don't Dr. Thompson, Professor Thompson, pick anyone, he'll respond. But how we're going to eventually be able to move that needle, move into that space and change things without that conversation taking place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also almost ironic to be talking about empathy when Donald Trump is in office. I mean, this person has no empathy really for anyone. And we have to ask ourselves, why does our political climate allow for that? Why was he so successful in tapping into people's angers, fears, the fact that he was a provocateur, the fact that he, exploited racial fears? We will not forget that his first run for office was all about birtherism. And it's an old playbook, as I write in my preface.
He did all that, but he also spoke to working class whites in a way that made them think he actually did care about them.
Right, no, he did both. But this is the point is he was all over the map. He very much talked about returning jobs. In his inaugural address, which I've read, he talked about the American dream. He talked about promising health care. He offered a wide playbook of things that he promised to some people, but then he also very much was in the attack mode about demeaning people, about creating nasty names for people. That was also part of his performative act. And one of the things this is also a part of American politics, and I think this is the problem with empathy, is that all the way back in the 1920s, they were saying, well, in American politics and American democracy, people often like to vote against the person they hate more than vote for the person they even like. Wow. So this is, I think it's a really big challenge. I think it's a challenge because politicians exploit our basic emotions. As I've always said, politics tends to be more irrational than rational. We may like to imagine that people understand everything about their world and that they can see what is in their best interest, but this is often shown again and again through history that people do not vote their self-interest, they vote against it. So I feel like this gets back to our conversation about the big problem in the room is often ideology. that ideology is often divorced from the reality of what people know and what their experiences are. And politicians exploit that ideology. And this is where we talked about how do we create a language that can challenge the ideology we have and is very much in place, but then also create a language that allows us to begin a conversation and not, and I have to say one more thing. I teach at LSU in Baton Rouge. My history department secretary, she's a wonderful, sweet woman. She is a good Christian, but she's also someone who voted for Donald Trump. And I really believe that there's a way that if we would stop, if there was a space where you could just talk to people as people, if it is in the play box, but just talk to people, then suddenly it isn't about just hating one group and calling them stupid and thinking it's hopeless and finding a way. And the internet is the worst thing possible. The internet only exploits our anger and our hostility and our inability to communicate.
This has gone way too fast, and I'm really sorry. I hope you guys have really liked this conversation, because I certainly have. But I'm getting a high sign that we have to pull the plug on this, and I want to give each of the two panelists a chance to say, if you were in the position to really change one or two things that you believe would be the greatest contribution that we can make to achieving this awareness, this understanding of, and creating this empathy and compassion across the races, across classes, in a way that we began to work together and identify with each other for a better America, a better democracy, what kind of things come to your mind?
Well, for me, what comes to mind are our children and our elders. 700 children were killed in Chicago last year. And I really feel for the kids who died at the high school in Florida. But I feel until we grieve for every child, that these 700 black children's lives are just as important on the news to everybody as the kids in Florida, that until we can build that kind of humanity, I don't think we get to the head. I don't think we sort out the ideology. It's really very fundamental. I believe cancer is cancer, suffering is suffering, children are children, our elders are our elders, and we got to build our humanism at that level.
But it's begging the question, how do we do that, Professor
Well,
Thompson?
we start with a conversation about let's have the mothers. Yesterday, I was in Queens, and somebody brought mothers from Flint, Michigan, and lined them up, mothers, to talk about lead paint. And then we had public housing mothers who were concerned about their kids having lead in the pipes in Michigan, lead in the paint in public housing. And then we had a coming together of people. And I just think we have to have comings together of people so people can learn and tell each other stories. I think at a human level, a child is a child. Everybody loves their child, but we can't, you said the media, the internet, I don't think we can rely on those instruments. And that was my critique of social scientists.
Right.
We can't rely on the language of social science. We can't rely on CNN and MSNBC. We have to begin to construct our human interactions ourselves. That's what I think. That's the real organizing that we need to do.
With community organizations.
That's what we need to do.
Perfect.
Right.
Perfect.
And not just focused on, I'm going to fight around my issue. You know, the issue has to be building this common human bond amongst us. That has to be the main issue.
Yeah,
so, Professor Isenberg.
Yeah, I mean, I would back that up because my first book that I wrote was on the early women's rights movement and the way they organized. And remember, this is in the 1840s, and women didn't get the vote till 1920. I know that's depressing, but the point is that the way they mobilized was to organize conventions, was to bring groups of people together and to organize. And I've become more and more as I get older and older, feeling that you have to learn to communicate we have to return to communication face to face. There's a fundamental difference. I don't care what anyone says. You will be much nicer and polite to someone when you look them in the eye than when you get on the internet and, you know, list all your insults, because you don't, that's a disembodied person, you don't know who that is. So I think we have to find a way, whether it's remobilizing new kinds of town meetings, and what I would add is, since I am a historian, and I believe history is really important, is, as I said, find a way not just to talk about issues, but to historicize who we are as this diverse people, and to try to recover that to find where there is common ground, instead of thinking that we are all just divided groups and we have nothing, we have absolutely nothing to share, absolutely nothing to talk about.
Okay. On that note, please join me in thanking our guests for helping us with this.
Thank you.
So,
Okay.